All right, everybody, welcome back. So we're continuing on. So our previous lecture, we discussed sort of the big main molecules of life, and now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be understanding how those molecules become the cell, um, and what structures are important in terms of the formation of the cell and the formation of cell theory. So the cell, as we've sort of discussed previously when we looked at sort of the prokaryotes and eukaryotes in terms of life, they're the most basic structural unit of all life on Earth. And all cells have this same basic architecture. Again, we sort of talked about this in our previous lectures when we were looking at the differences between those different branches of life. And one of the critical things that helps define cells and their structure are phospholipids. So we talked about these previous. We talked about this previous in our previous lecture when we were looking at the different types of lipids. And one of the most important ones are these ones called phospholipids, where you have a phosphate head and these lipid tails that are both hydrophobic and hydrophilic. And ultimately, cells are bounded by a cell membrane, and they have this double bilayer. And it separates the contents of a cell from its environment. And these these cell membranes are created using this phospholipid. So you have this phospholipid bilayer where you have these water-loving uh, where you have these water-based interiors, and you have these hydrophilic water loving heads and then these hydrophobic tails. And ultimately, what this helps do is it keeps the water that's inside contained structurally in the cell, and then the water that is outside contained as well. And then with having these hydrophobic tails, water is able to pass through these areas in sort of passive diffusion, and this is what uh, allows cells to maintain their structure in these environments. So, the second structural thing we want to address with the cell is actually to think a little bit not just about the cell and cell structure, but actually where cells reside and how they maintain their structure. And ultimately, we have to talk about water. And water has been sort of a proxy for life on Earth. All of life's chemical reactions take place in water. So when we're talking about the habitat of a cell, we're talking ultimately about water. And we have to, in order to understand what makes water such a important and special material, we have to actually look at its chemical structure. It's composed of oxygen and hydrogen atoms, and because because of its unique shape, where we get this dipole moment where we have hydrogens at one side and oxygen at the other, you get these positive and negative charges on this molecule that enables it to be essentially sticky, because it's able to form bonds both with itself um, uh, and with other molecules. And I'm going to have you watch another video that specifically looks at all the different functions that this polarity creates, um, and ultimately how the chemical structure allows for life on Earth. So, what do I mean when I say that water is polar? Essentially, what that's saying is that the electrons in the bonds are not shared equally between the atoms. And it creates this partial negative charge at one end. It's this partial positive charge at the other. And this again is what sort of makes this molecule sticky and able to bond with with both other hydrogens and other molecules. So even though we've sort of been able to discuss a little bit about um, things that characterize life and spaces that characterize life, like water. There are many infectious agents and microbes that defy that definition of being alive. We talked previously about archaea and bacteria that live in these hydrothermic vents or in areas with high salinity that by the definitions that we've been using so far, they should not be able to survive. Additionally, viruses. Viruses don't contain are not a cellular unit, so they don't have that base cellular structure that we think of as needing to create life. Likewise, prions are not cellular; they're infectious proteins. Several years ago we had a mad cow outbreak, and that was a prion disease. And so they're not infectious. They're not cellular, but they are infectious proteins that replicate in cells, causing disease. So they are in some ways lifelike. So while for the most part we're able to really define what life is, there are still exceptions to this rule, and we're able to sort of understand that life can exist sort of beyond these strict definitions that we've been using thus far. So in summary for these things, we know that living organisms grow, reproduce, maintain homeostasis, sense and respond to their environment, and rely on energy to carry out their functions. We've learned that all matter is composed of elements. There are 4 types of carbon-based organic molecule that make up living things: proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and lipids. And living organisms are made out of cells, which is the smallest unit of life. And where we're gonna start moving towards now is to think more specifically about the cell and look at the cell structure and function. So we'll pick up there next time. Okay, bye.